Hello? 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 Act 2. And when he had crossed the bridge, the phantoms came to meet him. He felt like weeping, began to pray. "O Lord," he said, "please let me live to return home, so that I might hold my dear, sweet Ellen in my arms once more." He felt a dark, troubling thoughts of what she would do if something should happen to him. Would she herself survive the burden of grief? He didn't know. Then suddenly, yes, it was the rattle and clatter of a coach and horses. He put his hand across his brow to block out the sun. Coming, as if driven by hellish fury, was a coach. Undoubtedly this was Count Orlok's coach. He had kept his promise. Jonathan breathed a sigh of relief, felt his fears grow diminished. The coach pulled up beside him, the driver, a man in a peaked cap and huge coat, the collar pulled around his face, the face hidden by the pointed brim. The cap seemed an old-fashioned thing, with the plume of a feather in the bill. In fact, the driver seemed to be dressed as if he had stepped from perhaps a century back. Suddenly pointed forward with his whip, did the driver. Suddenly pointed forward with his whip hand, indicating without words that they were driving forward to the castle. Jonathan quickly grabbed his bags and with some difficulty placed them inside. Then he ascended himself into the coach, and like lightning they were away. It was a ride through the wildest country he had yet seen, going up rocky mountain roads, past beetling precipices perched over yawning canyons that seemed to lead into hell itself. And the sun was setting. Around him he could hear the howl of wolves, see the weird fiery glow emitted like phosphorescence from deep within the black well of the ancient trees. That glow, driver, what causes that strange glow? Hutter looked into the night at what seemed to be a weird dancing circle of flame. The driver did not answer, but instead stopped the coach along the mountain pass, and flying into the forest beyond, was gone for what seemed an interminable period of time. Hutter began to be worried again, but just then the strange, silent figure returned, illuminated by the light of a pale, unholy moon. He returned to his perch atop the coach. Hutter was puzzled by the whole thing, of course, but it was not many moments later that the most frightening event yet transpired. Hutter was shaken from a half-dreaming state by the crack of the whip, the startled sound of the horses rearing back, and the curses, in Hungarian, of the driver. Hutter looked from the coach, his blood suddenly running cold. Black, dog-like shapes with burning eyes were standing in the midst of the forest pathway. Hutter could see that they were wolves, and even by the light of the moon he could see their deadly white jaws slavering, drooling, and he knew how dangerously hungry they were. Hutter felt his heart leap to his throat. He could hear the driver snarl and curse. The whip cracked, the horses neighed. Hutter wished quite badly for this whole ordeal to end. Simply to get to the castle had been a nightmare thus far, he thought madly. What else can happen? Now it is as if we are done for. But just then an unaccountable thing occurred. The vicious, slavering wolf pack suddenly seemed to whimper and retreat, slowly, then disappearing with great rapidity into the trees. The coachman cracked his whip at the horses, and the slow, rattling vehicle began to creep forward, finally plunging ahead again at the same breakneck speed. I would not have believed it possible, Hutter thought to himself. But he realized that the coachman must have been used to such occurrences, and he felt he could relax a little, as he was in capable hands. Then, after having been lulled asleep by the incessant rocking motion and his own bone-deep weariness, Hutter came awake when the coachman finally barked, "We are almost there, young master." Hutter sat up. Out the window, gleaming in the spectral moonlight, Hutter got his first glimpse of Castle Orlok. It was a monstrous, ruined, jagged tooth set in the rotting gums of jutting rock and sparse trees surrounding it. Vast with dark eyeless windows and ruined battlements, it was the very picture of desolation and gloom. Was it a ruins? How, thought Hutter, could anyone possibly live here? The coach drove up the winding road toward the drawbridge. Hutter hoped they could cross the rotting thing without falling through. They cluttered over the creaking boards and then into the mouth of a courtyard, the horses clomping over the cobbles. A single torch burned at an arched entrance. "Now you may get out," said the driver. Hutter did so, reaching in to claim his bags. The coach drove off quickly, disappearing into what appeared to be a tunnel beneath the wall. Hutter found himself alone, lost, afraid again. The long entryway was pitch dark. He could see nothing, but he went forward slowly. Then a yellowish gleam in the dark. Someone was indeed coming forward in the black. Was it the Count? Indeed it was. But from the first time Hutter laid eyes upon this strange personage, he regretted ever having set foot upon the soil of that accursed land, as the figure he saw seemed to be a cadaverous phantom, come straight from the bowels of some dark, horrible dream. The figure that came forward in the black was exceedingly tall and cadaverously thin, as if he were a figure that had been deliberately starved to skin and bones. His long arms and long, thin, skeletal fingers ended in talons, nails that seemingly had never been clipped, and looked like the claws of some wild animal. The skin was a leprous, unhealthy pallor, looking more like the waxen skin of some dead man. The head was bald, the face exceedingly long and thin and narrow, with high cheekbones, ending at a pointed chin, with a simply enormous sloping nose that curved downward over a cruel, disfigured, rat-like mouth, bearing two razor-sharp front teeth, jutting over thick, pouting lips. The brows were bushy punctuations, but it was the eyes, yes, the eyes that were worst of all, hideous twin orbs of emptiness that seemed to project phantom rays upon whatever object they fell. Altogether, Hutter was certain he had never before seen such a ghastly, nightmarish character in all of his born days. It was like an ogre from a storybook come to life. Even more peculiar, the Count's clothing seemed long out of date, the coat being something a boyar might have worn a century back. The Count approached him, and Hutter found himself instinctively reeling back. Count Orlok said, "You are late, young man. It is almost midnight. My servants have all retired." Hutter had no reply to this, so simply nodded, his eyes going wide to peer at the Count. The Count simply flicked one of his immensely long, talon-like nails, and Hutter, understanding, followed him with growing anxiety into the mouth of the dark entryway. For the time being, he was home. The Count led Hutter through the ruined corridors of his ancient, crumbling keep, past the huge central staircase, which was completely covered in front by a massive web, and down a darkened hall where, at a decrepit wooden door, the Count stopped, extracted a pair of rattling iron keys, and, unlocking the rusted lock, invited Hutter to enter and seat himself by the fire. "Enter freely of your own will," said Count Orlok, "and leave some of the happiness you bring." Hutter did just that, taking off his hat and going to the table. Upon it stood a silver tray, a loaf, cheese, a bottle of rare wine, and a silver goblet. A warm, inviting fire burned in the massive grate. Hutter took the lid from the tray. A massive flank of beef, sitting amid a swamp of potatoes and other vegetables, wafted a rare and delicious aroma up to his nostrils. Famished, he fell to eating. Picking up the loaf, he began to slice. Suddenly, ouch! He managed to cut his thumb somehow on the blade. The Count, who had been hovering over the table with a weird, vulpine, frozen smile, suddenly seemed to grow fiercely intense. looking as if his eyes were aflame. His long, skinny, claw-like fingers froze like gnarled living branches before him, and he hissed between his rat-like little teeth, "Blood! Your precious blood!" Hutter found the Count's behavior rather unnerving. He shrank back a little, though still seated, and inadvertently the beaded rosary necklace the old woman at the village inn had given him fell out from around his collar. Exposed, the Count, seemingly, did not like to see it. He turned his skeletal face to the wall, hissing again, his eyes narrowing to angry slits. Hutter felt a moment of confused panic. He did not know if he was going to have the nerve to stay with this strange man the entire night. Count Orlok said, "Let us chat together a moment, my friend. There are still several hours until dawn, and I have the whole day to sleep." Hutter ate the remainder of his food, but more slowly now, reflectively. He felt his appetite had slipped a little. The Count spent much of the night regaling Hutter with tales of his ancestral homeland, the daring-do bloody battles and adventures of his forebears, their struggle fending off the advances of the Turks into Christian Europe, of battles fought and won with cruel sadism, torture, and even living impalements. What witch or devil was ever so powerful as Attila, whose blood flows through these veins? Ah, but the victories of my ancestors are now but a tale to be told. The Count seemed, when he spoke thus, far away, as if his mind were somehow actually reliving events he was merely separated from by the gulf of time. It is not as if he is remembering stories, thought Hutter, but recalling events as if he had actually been there and lived them. Most curious. Hutter found himself finally giving way to slumber after having fought to stay awake, even as Graf Orlok's voice droned on and on. It was many hours later, with the sun pouring in through the window, the fire in the huge stone fireplace having gone out, that Hutter roused himself from a night of uneasy, half-remembered dreams. It had all been blood and pain, battles and carrion dogs chasing death across a war-torn ancient landscape. And at the center of it all, Hutter had seen a face looking curiously like that of Graf Orlok, and having two burning, wolf-like, demonic eyes. He got up slowly from the seat, his body aching, his head swimming with tales of bloody battles and half-forgotten bad dreams, and began to look around the room. Going to a wardrobe and throwing it open, he found that his clothing had all been brushed and hung very neatly for him. His belongings had been laid on the end table beside the sprawling bed with care. No doubt, Hutter at first thought, that the servants had been in while he slept in the chair. Then another thought began to trouble him. He had actually seen no servants since he had been here. Count Orlok had greeted Hutter by himself at the door, and the only other man he had seen since departing the carriage at the Borgo Pass was the Count's weird driver, and he had really not got a good look at that man, who had had his collar and his pointed peaked cap covering much of his face. Hutter felt a shiver steal up his spine. He felt a little watery in his guts, a little lonely and anxious. He went out, managing to find his way to a great door, pulling it open and exiting into the bright, glaring sunlight, going out into the court, his boots echoing against the cracked cobbles. The bridge was down, apparently so that a few carts could pass onto the grounds. Hutter peered closely, using his hand to cover his eyes. Were those a band of gypsies driving those carts? He was uncertain. If so, what could Count Orlok possibly want with them? Were they being utilized for manual labor? It seemed weirdly unlikely. Hutter continued to explore the grounds, walking into the garden, which was in as much decay and disrepair as everywhere else in the castle. The ground was choked with weeds, the herbage a weird mutation of ugly growth and putrefaction. Into the dark of the trees Hutter went, and down the hill to the river below. Overlooking it, an ancient tottering roof seemed to offer an inviting view. It was here, too, where he could write his letter. He sat, and taking out the scrap of paper and pencil, composed, "Ellen, my beloved, don't be unhappy. Though I am far away, I love you. This is a strange country. After my first night in the castle, I found 2 large bites on my neck. From mosquitoes? From spiders? I don't know. I have had some frightful dreams, but they were only dreams. You mustn't worry about me. I am leaving immediately to return to Bremen and to you." He sat up from his exertion. Before him the river rushed on, glistening in the dying sunlight, smelling of the wet and rot of fish, the murk of the water. The wind blew like the breath of a child through the trees. He suddenly wondered, how on earth am I to mail this? He thrust the letter into his pocket. He proceeded from the gazebo, down the path and back through the trees, going down the sloping side of the hill, back toward the gated garden entrance. Just then he spied a man with a pack coming up the pathway toward him, a walking stick in his hand, evidently an explorer. As Hutter got close, he realized that the man, who wore bright, colorful clothing and whose skin had a sun-blasted look, was indeed a gypsy. Hutter waved toward the man and hurried toward him, waving his letter in his hand. Approaching him, he could see that the man smiled, was missing a few teeth, but seemed, beneath his great mustache, pleasant enough. He spoke very poor German, and Hutter, for a few moments, was at a loss as to how to communicate with him what he desired. Finally, he seemed to make him understand that he wished for him to mail his letter to Ellen when next he was in town. "Ah, mail your letter. Yes, sir, on my honor." Finally, feeling somewhat mollified, but still realizing there was a chance Ellen would never see it, Hutter returned through the garden gate to the castle, a little lighter of step, but still, for all of that, feeling the gathering gloom of his life. Going through the ancient corridors, Hutter reflected, once, not long ago, in the streets of Wisborg, an old man stopped me to shake my hand. He told me, "Not so fast, young man. You cannot escape your fate." You cannot escape your fate. Now, what did he mean by that? Hutter gradually felt the creeping gloom turn into cold anxiety. He walked back through the desolate, crumbling halls, past the moth-eaten tapestries and faded portraits, to his room. Where was the Count? "I have all day to sleep, like the dead," he had told Hutter. He felt icy claws grip his spine. As twilight came on, the castle became alive with menacing shadows. Quite a satisfactory dinner had been laid out before him on the table, roast chicken, done up some way that was very good but made him thirsty. Paprika, he said to himself. The thing is cooked in paprika. There is also some dish with corn like pudding and bread, wine and cheese. A hearty salad topped it off. Finally, there was also coffee and biscuits. He skipped the biscuits, but the coffee was very rich and good. "Much appreciated, my dear Count," he laughed to himself, and stretching back on a couch, decided to read a little. It was from the Book of the Vampires, of course, which he had absconded with before leaving the little village inn. My, it seems as if that was long ago instead of just the other night. Hutter picked the dusty old volume up, opened at random, began again to read. Quote, "Nosferatu drinks the blood of the young, the blood necessary to his own existence. One can recognize the mark of the vampire by the trace of his fangs on the victim's throat." It was ghastly, chilling stuff. Gradually, Hutter got the feeling that he was not alone. He got up from the couch, went to the door of the bedroom, opened it. It took his eyes a few moments to make out the figure of Count Orlok in the gloomy corridor outside, but when he did, he found the image of the man was still startling. The long, cadaverous form came toward him in the gloom. "I thought," began the long rat-like face, hissing out from between his pointed, sharp little teeth, "that we might go over the details of my new home." "Why, yes," Hutter said, although just a little hesitantly. Certainly, Count, that would be a pleasure. Secretly, Hutter thought, yes, and the sooner I can get this over with and be on my way home, the better. Hutter sat with Count Orlok at the table where he had just eaten. "Oh, forgive me," the Count began, "but my servants have already retired for the evening. They will be in to clear away these dishes in the morning, while you are still asleep." Hutter smiled nervously. "Yes, well, I don't believe I've caught hide nor hair of them since I first arrived yesterday. You must keep them awfully busy, Count," although he reflected, not sure if he should tell the Count about the man he had handed over his letter to Ellen to earlier. "I did meet a man, a gypsy, I think, while out this morning, taking the breeze." The Count smiled a hideous, icy smile, his eyes blazing. He said, "Yes, Herr Hutter, the gypsies have been very useful to me, as help on the grounds in these old buildings, which often need repair. Now," and the Count grabbed up the title deed to his new home in Wisborg, examining the document with his blazing, piercing, and somehow frightening gaze, using his immensely long nails to trace every written line. After this, he noticed that Hutter had left a locket open upon the table. Inside was a picture of Ellen. The Count seemed to take a special delight in this, his lean face cracking into a more terrible grin than any Hutter had yet seen. "Is this your wife? What a lovely throat. That old mansion seems quite satisfactory. We shall be neighbors." "Oh, wonderful," thought Hutter. "Just the thing I've always wanted. Ellen, I'm certain, shall be thrilled." Then he thought, how strangely he put that. What a lovely throat. What could he mean by that? Again he found himself filled with uneasiness. Far away across the wild mountains of Transylvania, in little quaint, quiet and darkened Wisborg, Ellen, Hutter's wife, stirred in her sleep. The moonlight poured in through the sash on her milk-white face, which was now contorted in terror. Annie, dear, sweet Annie, slept beside her. In her dreaming mind, Ellen could see Jonathan, writhing in terror, while a long, dark shadow with thin arms and claw-like hoarded fingers crept up a stair. Oh, Hutter! Hutter awoke with a start, his face twisting into a look of shocked terror as his arms flew above his head, striking the wall behind the bed. Then she saw the dark shadow, the horrid form of the face of it. It was hideous, like a long, lean, dead man come back to life. A maniacal, mad, wolf-like gaze, sharp little teeth and burning eyes, the long, pointed ears of a rat, and a hellish, demoniacal spell cast from the cursed blazing sockets of its deep black orbs. A word, Nosfera, Nosfera. Her trembling lips mouthed these accursed syllables while she tossed and turned in her nightmarish fear. Soon Annie was awakened. Turning over, she saw with horror that Ellen had bit her lip. She tried to shake her writhing friend awake, but Ellen seemed to be almost insensate, as if she were in a death-like trance. She mouthed and named Jonathan. Oh, Jonathan! It was then that Ellen did the thing that Annie most had feared. She arose from the bed they shared and began to sleepwalk across the room. Annie, knowing that it could be dangerous to wake her at this point, she had slept in the same bed with Ellen before, when she had also sleepwalked, and had been warned when still a girl never to wake her friend, got up and followed on tiptoes. The servant was in the hall, holding a candelabrum up. When she saw what was happening, she said in a whisper, "The master is awake. He is in his study with the doctor. I shall go and fetch him." "Yes," whispered Annie back. "Please do so." And so she did. In a short amount of time, Annie's father and Dr. Bulwer had both assembled in the hall, and, whispering to each other and exchanging glances, had commenced to follow Ellen as she made her way out to the terrace. Walking along the edge, the three followers feared she might fall far, a frightening prospect of her hurting herself. Above, Annie gasped to see Ellen framed against the moonlit clouds, her hands thrust out in front of her. Her dainty white feet slipped along the cold marble edge of the terrace balustrade. Mr. Harding could see that she was about to fall. For a terrible moment the men did not know which way the slipping Ellen would fall, either into their arms or quite possibly to her death in the garden below. He and Dr. Bulwer raced forward, just in time to catch her in their grasps. Of course, this was after Mr. Harding reached up with one of his great hands, like a bear claw made of scuffed leather, and grabbed Ellen by her robe. She was saved from herself for the time being. Annie had started to scream when she saw Ellen slip, but the scream had caught in her throat. The men took Ellen back to their room. Dr. Bulwer pronounced that it must have been due to a, quote, sudden fever, unquote. Dr. Bulwer would later write, quote, since then I have learned that she had sensed the menace of Nosferatu that very night, and Hutter, far away, had heard her cries of warning. Far away through the wild and dark forests of the Carpathians, in a wretched crumbling castle perched atop a beetling precipice, Hutter had reared back on his bed, throwing his hands above his head in terror, as a pale, deathly, skull-like face with burning eyes glared down upon him. The face bore the unmistakable look of ravenous hunger. An insensible, almost idiotic madness. But those fiery eyes beneath the bushy long brows, those eyes froze his blood with hypnotic fear. The being bent low, his long, talon-like nails creating icy rivulets of fear where they touched Hutter's flesh. The searing pain of a bite on the neck rendered Hutter a limp, broken thing, fainting in the deep well of darkness as he lost consciousness. The lean, skeletal figure, now no longer hungry, turned and slowly, with the legs of a man returned from the grave, exited the room for the night. The door closed behind him as he went. Slowly the next morning the world came back to focus for Hutter. His hands at first went to his head, which felt as if it was big with drink, or that he had been perhaps beaten around the head the night before. It was throbbing. Then his hand went to the side of his neck. Ouch! More bites, he knew. His mind remembered a burning, skull-like visage, a tall, skeletal human rodent with satanic eyes. Orlok. More bites, he knew. Hutter stumbled from the couch whereon he lay and proceeded out the door, stumbling down the darkened corridor. One thing he knew for certain, Graf Orlok would be asleep. The man himself said he slept by day, had he not? Feeling some inner compulsion, Hutter made his slow, painful, but increasingly quickening way down the dark hall to the door wherein he had made an exit to the courtyard and outside yesterday. He went out into the light, suddenly feeling dizzy, nauseous. No matter, he must continue. He had a strange, dreamlike feeling about him, almost as if he were in a trance. He began to explore the court, coming to various doors. Where, he wondered, was the chapel? He finally found a door marked by an ancient symbol, but not one he recognized. Ah, he felt this must be a place of importance. He put his hand out to touch the door. He felt a bolt of electricity move through his arm as he swung it open to descend a short flight of stone steps. What, was this some sort of crypt, he wondered? He pulled the heavy webs covering the entrance down, choked a bit at the heavy dust. The smells down here were of trapped air, mold, dust, and turned earth, and decay. It was an awful smell, and as Hutter descended the steps the rest of the way, looking at the dark massed boxes below, just able to see them by the trickling light pouring in from above, he knew that yes, indeed, this was the Orlok family crypt. He continued down, still feeling as if he were simply having a dream. Before him he saw a coffin that looked as if the top half of it would pull back to reveal the body within. He went forward. He hesitated a moment before leaping to action, his mind seeming detached from the movements of his physical form. It took his eyes a moment to adjust to the vision within, to see it and to truly believe what he was seeing. No, he said to himself, it can't be. Why, it isn't possible. Hutter clutched his heaving chest, falling backward as an icy bolt of shock left him reeling. He began to retreat backward, not able to take his eyes off the coffin and its lone occupant. No mistaking it, the thin, pointed chin, sharp little teeth, bald pate, hellish eyes beneath shaggy brows, the long, sloping nose, the deathly, almost grey pallor. Orlok. Graf Orlok. Why, the man is... But Hutter found himself reeling backward in terror from that accursed face. End of Act 2, Nosferatu, adapted from the screenplay by Henrik Galeen.